this morning. I trust everybody's had a wonderful week, and I hope to be able to add to that over the next hour approximately for this class. My name is Les McClelland. I'm a Unity minister, being ordained in 1970 something or other. 71. My wife tells me it's 1971, so she helps remember things that I can't remember anymore. I'm going to be sharing with you some thoughts on the co-founders of Unity and movement that we know now as the Unity movement. One of the great things that we all need to, I think, need to appreciate and understand is that they were human beings. They weren't perfect. They had their blemishes and flaws like every single one of us and every person that we ever meet. And they had things that were in their lives that are common to our lives. They had desires and dreams and goals and all of that. And they met one another at one particular point in time, and ultimately, sometime later, I think it was around 6 years before they actually got married after their initial introduction to one another. One of the interesting things about it is that Charles and Myrtle had their maladies in terms of their physical health. Charles, as a young child, fell one time and injured his hip, and come to find out that hip actually became problematic to him, and caused the leg to wither and would not grow like the other leg did. It was because the hip was out of the socket. They didn't have x-ray back then, so they didn't know what was going on, and they just knew he had a lot of discomfort, a lot of pain, and he grew up like that, and this impacted his life totally unexpectedly. Because of the injury, he could not go out and play with the other kids of his age. And so what he did do is he used that time, not consciously, he tried to fill it up with things that of interest to him, and he read. He became an avid reader. He read William James and Shakespeare and just a host of other luminaries in the world at that time, and remained there today by many, many people. And out of that desire to understand what they were writing about, he developed a resource of information in his own mind. And I'll switch over to Myrtle. Myrtle was a young girl growing up. She came from Ohio, and her last name was Page. She was an interesting girl. She had interesting interests and all of that, and she became actually ultimately a graduate of a university. She became really highly schooled in education, became a teacher, as a matter of fact. And ultimately they met one another and then separated and went their separate ways. And Charles became an adult, and he had a lift on his leg so that he could walk because he had that leg that just didn't grow the same way. Myrtle, on the other hand, was told that as a young child growing up, she had an illness that they considered to be terminal, and they weren't quite sure exactly what it was. They gave it a name which I do not remember at this point in time, but basically she accepted the idea that at that point in time that she wasn't going to live very long, but she had a desire to live, a strong desire to live. And this was before an event that took place in Myrtle and Charles's life, focused on Myrtle at this particular point, because Myrtle is the primary person through which Unity ultimately became founded. Charles came along with the curiosity, and he was more head-oriented. Myrtle was more heart-oriented. And Myrtle and Charles, they had met, they had gotten married, they had gone through a lot of different things. And in that marriage, they were in Kansas City, and they went to a lecture. It was a doctor of, known as E.B. Weeks. Dr. E.B. Weeks was in town. He was going to be giving a lecture, and she got wind of it, Myrtle got wind of it, and wanted to hear him. Charles came along for the ride to be with her, and they attended that lecture, and Myrtle left that lecture hall that night. I don't recall and never have been able to figure out how many people were there attending that lecture by Dr. Weeks, but there was a goodly number of people that were forward-thinking and high in the curiosity field of perspective. They listened to Dr. Weeks, and Myrtle came along and ultimately left there with one thought of mind. It was the only thing that she could recall in many ways of that lecture, and that is, I am a perfect child of God, and therefore I do not inherit sickness. That was the thing. That little statement was everything. It actually ultimately gave birth to the Unity way of thinking, or originally it was considered New Thought kind of thing, had another name before that, but so New Thought in today's world is not a new thing. It's been around a long time, and Myrtle began to affirm that thought. This gave birth to such things, in my opinion, as the Daily Word of today, where every day has a statement in it, a little bit of an explanation about the statement itself, and a scripture reference. Okay, Myrtle didn't have all of that. She only had the statement, I am a perfect child of God, therefore I do not inherit sickness. Myrtle was destined, according to everybody's expectation, to die at an early age. She didn't do it. She lived till she was in the late 90s, somewhere in that particular vicinity. I don't recall the exact, I'm looking at it. Let's see. I don't seem to find my note. I know it's in there somewhere.
I think she died in 38, didn't she?
But she lived a long time.
Yeah.
Charles outlived her and married again with a lady, and she became an important part of his life after Myrtle had left. In fact, this lady was actually, I think, their secretary that traveled with them in many of their travels for Charles and Myrtle to lecture at different places. And when they arrived, they really drew a crowd. They developed connections with people from all around the United States. Some people from overseas, but not a whole lot, because travel was different then than what it is now. They didn't have the privilege of having computerization where people could sit in their home and listen to them. You had to go and be there and hear them. They didn't have microphones like we have now, where you can hear my voice and I don't have to shout. And not only that, but my voice is traveling throughout the world, potentially, depending on who's logged in. But Myrtle and Charles developed a life that ultimately brought all of us here to this location, this church right now. So it's impacted all of us, every single one of us. Their meeting and that lecture has impacted the lives of literally millions and millions of people all around the world at this particular point. So we can give them thanks for being here this morning, because it's a result of, I'm a perfect child of God, therefore I do not inherit sickness. Charles became infatuated with the idea that Myrtle was demonstrating. He couldn't explain it away. He was more scientifically oriented. Things were very logical. He was a businessman. He actually developed and amassed quite a fortune when they were in Kansas City in real estate, and then there was a depression that came along that wiped most everything out, and in the process of all of that, and during that period of time, they began to purchase ground where Unity Village is now, that ultimately developed into 1,400 acres of ground where Unity's headquarters currently exists. Their boys that they had were educated as well. They made sure that they had a good education. One became more of an architect than anything else. Lowell Fawkes kind of followed in the footsteps of his dad, and I personally knew Lowell when I was going through seminary. He used to set up on the second floor of the administration building in a little desk about twice the length of this counter in front of me, and he would say hi to everybody. He was in his late 80s at that particular point in time when I was going through, but if he got your name, he remembered it. And I remembered the first time I walked by when I was on my way to class one morning, he said, "Les," and I didn't recognize his voice. And I didn't even see him sitting there at that particular point in time. My focus was on getting to the classroom. And I was in a hurry of carrying the books and all of that, and I didn't turn around. I kept right on going. He says, "Lester." Now, when my name is called by Lester, I have a history to that. Because that's my mother used that name when I was in trouble. And I heard Lester, and I stopped. Who? And there he was. And he says, "Don't ignore me." And I said, "I didn't see you." He says, "Well, I called your name, called you Les." He says, and then I called Lester, and I said, "Yeah, you remembered of my mother." When I was a young boy, always got into trouble. He laughed. And when Lowell laughed, he kind of had a belly of a laugh and all, and that encounter still is a part of my history with him. And through him, all of us had the opportunity to hear a lot about his mom and his dad. And as I say, they were like all of us. His mother and dad were, and Charles and Myrtle, and their working together was interesting. Charles, as a result of Myrtle's healing and Charles' curiosity to try to figure out how that came about, what occurred was that Charles and Myrtle began to communicate with people who were likewise curious, but also interested in being healed themselves. And there was a host of things that were going on in the medical field of that day. I mean, pandemics were happening. Scarlet fever was not an uncommon thing. Measles was also a malady that was quite concerning. There were just a lot of different things as a result of a lack of knowledge were not able to be addressed. Okay, mumps was not an insignificant thing. So there was a lot of disease going around that the medical profession was wrestling with and trying to figure out what was happening. And the perspective of the human being, our bodies, was radically different. They didn't understand things like we do today. They had not heard anything about how the blood transports the disease in the body once it gets in there, that the bloodstream has an important facility to fulfill. But Charles was an individual that was very sharp mentally, was an individual that was well known throughout the Kansas City area, Kansas City, Missouri area, as well as his sons as they grew up. They became involved in things in the Kansas City area. They became members of like the Rotary Club and just a host of different things. They became involved. They were not observers by the very nature of the way they had been raised. They were taught to get involved, to become a part of it. If they joined an organization, it wasn't just to belong to the organization. It was to make a difference, Charles had that same drive to make a difference. And he took a road as a result of the way he approached everything, through the process of developing knowledge about whatever else he had an interest in. And he couldn't explain away why it was his wife, Myrtle, was healed. He knew it wasn't the medical profession, because they still use leeches and bloodletting and all of that to try to get rid of a virus. And in fact, I'm not even sure the word virus was around at that particular. That word did not get coined until later. But to share with you the humanness of Charles and Myrtle's relationship, there was a letter that I brought with me that was typed by Myrtle. She was the scribe of the family and all, and she actually wondered at some point in time, if she didn't do the writing, how would it ever get done? And so she makes a comment about that. This is a copy of the original letter that I came across when I was doing a lot of research and all. In fact, my notes for today's lesson, by the way, is all here. I don't know. I'm not going to go through them all.
Yeah.
But they are here, and part of those notes is this letter I want to share with you. It starts out, and it shows the humanness of the relationship that Charles and Myrtle had. And they were probably in their early 30s at this particular point in time when this letter was written. It was written on February the 26th, 1930 is the date of the letter. It starts out, Dear Granda, Granda. What that means, I haven't got the foggiest idea. She wasn't there for me to ask. Lowell was not there for me to ask, because by the time I was doing this, Lowell had passed away. And so the letter starts out like this. He says, I don't know what my family would do without me as their scribe. I suppose if I would refuse to do their writing, they might get at it themselves. Mr. Fillmore, that's her husband, that's how she referred to him. Mr. Fillmore has a way of adding an S to some of his business mail and forwarding the letter to me. In other words, Mrs. from Mr. he would add the S to Mr. to get it to her. Forward the letter to me for an answer, slipping the S in between the Mr. and the period, so that sometimes it's hardly visible. In other words, the S is just barely there, but whoever's opening the mail there, and this was in Kansas City at the time in which this letter was written, at their locations there, and all. I really do enjoy our correspondence. That's the end sentence of that paragraph. Last week, I visited Frances over at Lowell's instead of our customary evening in the ferry home. Every house they lived in, they named. The ferry home. This is where they were living at the time. The evening in the ferry home. And just an aside, they built a house out on the farm and there was no kitchen in it. Myrtle didn't like to cook. She felt it was a waste of time. She liked to eat, she just didn't like to cook. So when they built that house, it didn't have a kitchen. Nobody could understand that. She said, wow, you gotta have a kitchen. Myrtle put her foot down, said she built this house, it's not gonna have a kitchen.
They had a vegetarian cafeteria though.
Yes, they did. But she didn't do any of that cooking. She liked to eat, but she didn't like to cook. She appreciated the food, however. So she says, I visited Frances over at Lowell's instead of our customary evening in the ferry home, and she gave me this stationery to use in writing you. I started the letter the very next day. Now, I don't know what the stationery looked like, because the thing that I copied is just a plain old sheet of paper. I started the letter that very next day, but we never did get into first year, so many things came up needing attention that day. Lowell and Alice had gone to the opera. The Ring of Nibbling was the name of the opera, Nibelling. The Ring, R-I-N-G, of Nibbling. Rick insisted that Charles and I go on one of the nights. We folks of the present day have become so used to the movies and their quick action and all that we need re-education to enjoy the long sitting of opera like this one. In other words, it was not a 30-minute deal. It was not an hour deal. It could have been a 2-hour, 2.5-hour opera that was presented. We've had some real spring weather. Notice a change in conversation here. She jumped from the opera and the visit with Lowell and Frances to and Lowell's wife, Alice, and right over into a totally different subject in this paragraph. She said, we've had some real spring weather. Lowell came in Saturday with a half a dozen John quotes. That tells you April, Easter, from that beloved garden of his. So we know Lowell loved to garden. He loved to garden. He liked to put a seed in the ground and watch it spring up. Okay, loved that. We put one right in front, in the center of the table at our noon meal, and it seemed to shine out all over the room in its brightness. The children all appreciated your gifts at Christmas. They had such a bountiful Christmas. I was rather interested, she writes, to know that someone else beside me could have difficulty in naming their presents. When I read in your letter your thanks for the box of sachet or something, it's not quite sure what it was, or something, that Fran sent. A couple presents came to me that we had to have help in naming. The beauty and love and the joy of Christmas doesn't ask for names to their expressions, I suppose. And the real value are our keepsakes. So a gift to Myrtle had more meaning to it than even a word that you spoke to her. It had long-lasting memory in her mind. Okay. This is another bit. She changes again in this paragraph. This is another busy day, divided between the office and the local work. But I proposed in my heart, talking to herself, to get word to you today, even if only a note. All of the Fillmores send love. We wish you all of the joys of lovely spring. Lovingly yours.
Did you say that was 1930?
1930.
Okay.
19.
By the way, Myrtle lived to be 86.
Yeah. Yeah. So Myrtle and Charles's relationship, this particular letter, shows a lot about her and her relationship with her husband and the work that we're doing. Now, this was called the farm at this particular point in time. When they would go out to the farm, they ultimately developed orchards, apples, and peaches. They had gardens where they raised carrots and all other kinds of vegetables. From the apples, they not only sold them by the bushel, but they also converted them into cider. And at the point in time in which I got involved with Unity, you would go out there to a worship service up on the second floor. Everybody had to either walk upstairs or take an elevator that would hold probably about 5 people, do you think? It was a small elevator, take the elevator up, and it was up on the second floor, and a gentleman by the name of Ralph Ray was the minister at that particular point in time. He had married one of the granddaughters, and he was the minister there, and the meetings for the services were taking place at that point, where ultimately they created a library. But it was on the north end of the administration building on the second floor. They ultimately moved that to the center of the administration building because it had the supports to create a larger space, because Ralph Ray moved on from being the minister there, and I say young, they were younger than Pat and I are today, but by the name of Janie and Sig Paulson. And they were there for many, many years. Learned a lot from him and her. And one of the interesting things about Janie was that when people had problems, she would call it just a small thing. You know, in comparison to the rest of everything else, this issue can be a very small thing. So man, don't make a mountain out of a molehill. This is one way of looking at it. But Myrtle began to affirm that statement. Remember what it was? I'm a perfect child of God.
Therefore I do not inherit sins.
That affirmation is the birth affirmation for unity. It really is, in my opinion. It is what gave birth to it. It caused Charles curiosity and interest to try to figure out what was happening, because he couldn't explain it. You know, he just could not explain it. There was no medication that she was taking concerning that. This was the heartbeat of her desire to overcome the malady, because she didn't want to die. She wanted to live. Yes,
Hang on, let me get your.
Get that.
microphone on you.
Oh, okay. He decided that he would
It's not
figure
on.
out.
It says it's on, but.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I
He
don't have it.
decided he was gonna figure out
There we go.
what had happened
yes,
or what was happening, because people kept coming to the house wanting her to pray with them
Right.
and her to help heal them.
Right.
And so he decided he would figure it out, and he studied all the religions of the world that he could study at that time. And what he sensed was there was a thread, common thread to all of the faiths in the world. And yet still he couldn't figure out how her healing had taken place. And of course she was just busy healing herself and everybody else that came to the house. So he finally decided, in my confusion, I will go to headquarters. And so his going to headquarters was to meditate,
right,
and to meditate for hours at a time. And he might sit in meditation for several hours. And Rosemary, I took a class under her one time, the granddaughter, and she said that when a young man would come to pick her up to date when she was a teenager, he might be sitting meditating. And the young man would look at him kind of strange, because he'd look a little strange, in meditation. And a little different, wouldn't say hi, wouldn't greet him, wouldn't do any of that kind of stuff. And so that was a little different. And so she said that she would just say to the young man, he's in the silence. And of course, the young man had no choice but to accept that. But it was a strange situation when somebody would come to pick her up for a date, because Papa Fillmore might be sitting there and having been sat there for a few hours and going to be there maybe the rest of the evening. I don't know. He apparently spent many hours to try to understand healing and how it wove through every one of the religions that he could study at the time. And of course the funny aside was the fact that when she was picked up for a date by a young man, they would all look at him kind of strange, because
and to capitalize on that thought, when somebody says he's in the silence, there's no reference to that word silence for a person who is not around anything like that, which many of the suitors for Rosemary were in that category. So they didn't have a reference point to try to actually understand what in the world is the silence. But as a suitor, you don't expose your ignorance. Your response was, oh, okay.
As if everybody goes.
As if everybody knows what the silence is, yes.
Well, what I'm trying to understand is, he was intellectually trying to figure out how these people are being healed, but where was his faith? I don't get that.
Well, it
his-
grows.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just gonna say, I think like everybody, we learn how to have that faith. We learn how to, one step leads to the other.
Yeah.
So eventually, it did lead to faith, and he
Yeah.
accepted it,
Right.
like God's healing.
Yeah.
But, I meditate today, but that doesn't mean I have lack of faith. It just means
Right.
that it's one of our tools.
Yeah.
Well,
And
to
he
me,
spent some-
meditation is communication with God.
It
I mean,
is.
that's how I communicate with God within me.
And
Yeah.
that's how he gleaned the knowledge as to what was happening. And healing
Okay.
is one of the foundational
That clears it up.
things of
Okay.
unity.
Hey, the second thing is, did he ever heal his hip?
You did.
What?
Yeah, his
Oh,
leg.
yeah, we'll
He did?
get to that, In fact, since you brought it up, we'll go ahead and focus on that, because that was, in his mind, if his wife could be able to be healed, which which she obviously was. She became a very vibrant, energetic person that had a bright outlook on life, but she spoke from her heart. In all of her writings, in fact, you can see this in books that were published from the writings that she had produced. She speaks more from a feeling and emotional perspective toward life. She's never really harsh in her writing to anybody. And if a person is experiencing an issue or wanting prayer or whatever, she always spoke from the heart. And she never addressed the individual because maybe in her mind she recognizes the individual's off the mark. Some, she spoke from the heart, and she would simply say something like, God is a perfect presence within you, and we know that everything in your life is really going to get resolved. We don't know how, but it will. That would be a typical response.
Wow. Yeah.
She doesn't call the malady out as being a problem. She doesn't emphasize the difficulty, but she focuses upon the activity of life itself and its ability to bring about a resolution that is in the best interest of the individual. She doesn't empower the idea at all. Okay? Now, the other thing I want to share with you this morning is the fact that Charles' leg, ultimately, it took a long time for his leg to respond. At one point, he had to lift about 4 inches on his leg that had withered. And through this search for understanding and the direction that it took, he began to use his own body as a test tube, so to speak, as a project. If Myrtle can get healed, I can too. So he began to work on that, and the leg actually did respond, and to the point that he didn't require a lift later in life. I mean, really later in life. But he didn't always walk with a limp, because the leg was never as full as the other leg. But the lift requirement was changed. Now, that's a miracle, as well as Myrtle's healing would have been considered a miracle. But because of Myrtle's healing, she became the focal point of people who were needing help because they had seen her and heard about her from others as having experienced her own healing and was praying for other people. So Myrtle had many sessions with people that would come to the place in Kansas City where they lived and where the vegetarian restaurant was just down the street there, and all in their home was right there. Had many people where they would come and visit with her, and she'd have a prayer session with them, and on the way, but always knowing that everything is in, to use my word, that is not something that I coined, it's something somebody else coined. Everything is in divine order. Everything is in the place that it needs to be for the best to come forth to you. That was a challenging thought, because when people are in the midst of the storm, they don't think that's the place they want to be. They really don't, because the storm is the storm, okay? Let me share with you a writing, a statement that Myrtle made. This would be a typical response that Myrtle would give. This was written on March the 3rd of 1928. It's part of Myrtle Fillmore's letters. There's a book that they had there that were the letters of Myrtle Fillmore. And this was a response she would give often. In fact, might be to now Pat, my wife, worked in Silent Unity for a while, as I recall, when you went through seminary. Is that correct?
That was required.
It was a required part of her educational journey, going to the ministerial training program. And the people in Silent Unity might have used this particular reference. It comes from Myrtle Fillmore, March the 3rd, 1928. She says, "The winds of God are blowing, and happy are we when we set our sails with the gales and take advantage of every opportunity in the name of the Lord." Somebody writing in or calling in at that particular point in time, most likely writing in 1928. Do you remember what the telephone system might have looked like in 1928?
Pretty primitive.
Ring,
Oh, yeah, my sister
ring. My grandmother's phone was 2 shorts and a long. Ring, ring, ring.
I remember those.
And when somebody picked the phone up, you would always hear
Click, 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 click.
click, 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 click. Everybody that was on that same line would be listening in.
Yeah.
So there was no sense, there was nothing like a private conversation on the phone. Everybody wanted in on the news.
Yeah. Yeah.
My grandmother's name was Alice, and Martha Alice McClelland. And when she would answer the phone, there were 4 people on her line.
Yeah.
Okay, and she'd call them out by name, so she could hear the click, 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 click. Did you do, all of them were on there, or 3 of them on there? And she'd call them out by name. "I want a private conversation, please. Please hang up." And if there was only click, click, 2 clicks, that meant 2 more were still listening. So.
That wasn't that long ago, early 80s here.
To some people in the country,
Yeah,
Oh,
we had
yeah.
a party line in the early 80s and it was the same way.
I had party line in the late 80s. I was in such a rural area.
The thing about that telephone system, and I don't want to get off the mark here, but the thing about that telephone system is it required a battery, 2 of them,
Oh, okay.
that was inside the box.
Yeah.
And they came in different designs. My grandmother's had 2 bells up at the top that rang when the phone rang. And right below it was a protrusion coming out with a microphone in it.
Yeah.
And right below it was the place where the batteries resided. And that gave power to that phone that was hooked up to the wire that ran to the house.
Yeah.
Not everybody had the wire that ran to the house. Therefore, they did not have a phone. They could not get a phone call until that wire was installed in the house. And if the telephone poles, remember them, not power lines, the telephone poles was always referred to. And anybody that had a telephone was doing not too bad. And you're right, it hasn't been too many years ago when you stop to think about it, but in order to have that reference point, it tells a lot about how old we are. Now, that's one thing that Myrtle would say. She wrote, there was a letter, another one in March, in which she writes, "Heretofore men have worked for money, Now, this is kind of a prophetic thing. Men have worked for money, labored for a living. Now men are going to be forced to see that work is for the purpose of expressing God-given faculties and powers and for loving service in the way that is truly beneficial. Think about that for a moment. Think about that just for a moment. The perspective of the value of work, the perspective of the value of work was for the purpose of giving loving service to people. Let me reread it. Now, men are going to be forced to see that work is for the purpose of expressing God-given faculties and powers and for loving service in the way that is truly beneficial. We've not arrived there yet because work is, in many people's mind, not for loving service, but for making mammon, money. Okay. The value of one's expertise provides that individual the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of others through what you do. World of difference in terms of the value of being a minister, being a doctor, being an educator, being a person who works on the road, that digs ditches. It has a value that is aligned with the activity of the Spirit of God, giving expression to something beneficial. World of difference. That's a prophecy that Myrtle has shared in the response of a letter she shared with another person that was asking for prayer. And we know it had something to do by the response she gives with what's going on in that person's life. We don't know the nature of it, but we do know that it was addressing the issue. It is 10 o'clock already. How long do we go?
You have till 10:15.
10:15, okay, I don't want to go overboard here. Another letter that she wrote dealing with thoughts of plenty and blessings. This is a part of a letter, not the whole part of it, but the heart of the letter. Written on February the 20th, again in the same year of 1928. She writes, "Dwell upon the thought that there is plenty for all, and that as you use what comes your way with the thought of blessing upon it, you are really setting free the streams of abundance which will go out and prosper all." Think about that. You hear the heart in that response? It's not an intellectual thing. It's the heart. March the 5th, same year. It's a glorious thing to open the heart to the joy of the Lord and to realize that it is truly a wellspring of peace and light within you. Think about that. How many issues of life does that address? Yeah, it's broad, isn't it? Myrtle had a way of communicating from a 30,000-foot viewpoint. Charles was down here dealing with the activities of going on, person's life. He would be more specific. Myrtle is not that specific because you saw it from a different perspective. That's the reason why Silent Unity, which is a worldwide organization, and it is an organization that exists from contributions from around the world, from people who have called in and received help. And there are so many different experiences that an individual sitting in Lee Summit, Missouri, at Unity Village, talking to a person in Africa that you don't even have common language with one another, can, in an attitude of prayer, bring forth a blessing for that individual. And you think about that. You're here in Missouri talking to somebody in Africa where there's no running water, where there's racism that you've never, ever seen or experienced here, to starvation issues, a baby being born that doesn't survive. Think about that. And your ability to pray. Such a prayer. Fillmore prayed. We all have that capability. Yes, ma'am.
Is it on?
Yeah, it's on.
By the time I was in seminary, I had asked, and spent time in Silent Unity, but I had asked how many people, because at least two of my classmates were interpreters for Unity. One in Germany, or in German, and the other in French. And I think the third one was in Spanish. And they would translate letters into Germany and into German and French and Spanish. And I asked how many times somebody had called in or written in that they couldn't respond. They couldn't find anyone because there were lots of people from lots of different languages around Unity Village to answer those phones. And they said at that time, and this was in 83 or 4, before 85, had been, I think, 2. They said there had been 2 phone calls come into the prayer room that they had different people go to the phone to see if they could understand them, and they couldn't communicate with them. And so finally someone just started praying in a Middle Eastern language. They thought it was some dialect from Middle Eastern, the one that I knew most about. But they just started praying with that person who expressed anxiety in their temperament on the phone. And as they started praying with them, even in their own language, in whatever language it was they determined to try from the prayer room, they started praying with them, and they sensed the peace coming on that person by the way they responded on the other end. And so by 1984 or so, it had been only 2 that they could not fulfill. There were people with so many different languages available there in the prayer room, and several people to translate letters and so on. And even if you call today, they will ask, still, I think, they did me the last time I called, they will ask, would you like a letter to verify that, this call, or to support you in this call? And if you say yes, and they have your phone number, your address and so on, you will receive a letter and affirmations that support you in the work that you've asked them to do. in prayer. But only 2 by 84. I thought that was pretty amazing. Pretty amazing, because that was well over 100 years, I think, at that point.
We're getting close to, we've got about 5 minutes. There is one additional reference I want to end our session here with this morning, and then Paul, you would take care of the closing out.
Yeah,
All that,
okay.
if you're so kind to do that. Again, this is from Myrtle, 1928, March the 1st. This is a response, part of a response that she gave. And as I share it with you, see what you take from it. Pretend that you have written something or called asking for prayer on some particular issue that's going on in your life. Okay? Do you have an issue that you would like to have prayer on and resolution with? Is there anybody here that does not have an issue like that? I think we're all in the same boat, aren't we?
Let's see which one.
Yeah, there you go. And that's an important point. That really is an important point. Which one? We need to be as specific as we possibly can in our moment of travail. We really do. We need to call it out. We need to call it out. And if you're asking for prayer, you need to call it out. Because it's real to you, isn't it? It's a living entity in your life. You're experiencing it. So call it out. This is what she would write, something along this line. The thing that we need then is to bring our own consciousness, where we are, into the Christ standard of truth. That we shall always get desirable results. We shall know how to deal with every proposition. Will not depend upon men's opinion, but know that God's law is unchanging and infallible. God's law is unchanging and infallible. Change of conscience. We have to bring our own consciousness into the standard of Christ's consciousness. That's where we need to go. This is a response to you. If she were here today instead of me, a gray-haired lady about Pat's height,
But thinner.
yeah, well, a little bit. You can see pictures of her. And some, and by the way, a picture back then was a very significant event. Remember the old flash gunpowder up here? That was picture taking time. Not the little camera we have in our pocket that we call a cell phone. I want to thank you for being here this morning, each and every one of you. I thank you for all of you that are on the web, that have been listening, and hopefully that in some way, small or large, that this has had a blessed experience in your life. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Let's give Les a big round of applause for that.
I'd like to mention that Charles and Myrtle both loved their work. They just thrived on their work. And he said in his 94th year, I fairly sizzle with joy and enthusiasm, and I spring zeal and enthusiasm, and I spring forth with a mighty faith to do the work that is to be done by me. They both loved their work.
They did. It was not work. It was their life.
That's the definition of work.
Yes.
And love going back and really revisiting, touching upon the foundation of unity and why we're all here right now. Because, as you said, there are some things that really are unchangeable. And, you know, when we're talking about that pure essence that we call God, or we, you know, any other names that are attached to that, those things that are foundational, they do never change.
Yeah.
And although we have, you know, very modern issues and problems that are very relevant to all of us in our lives, many of those answers can be found from the very foundational teachings that we have. And so I thrive when I go to Unity Village and can go up into the archives. What's the very first thing that Sue and I will both do? We'll go both back into the cabinet and go pulling out the writings of Charles and Myrtle. And it just fills my being every time I do that. So I loved your lecture. Thank you so much. I'm going to give the announcements now. Don't forget there's a basket here for our donations. Next week, July 17th, the New Thought and World Religions class will be led by John Brocker on the Green Throw. Our annual summer fundraiser, the beach party, is August 5th. Do you have beach decor you would loan for the evening? We need volunteers to set up. You don't have to cook. Serving, cleanup, tearing down, and resetting for Sunday. We're asking for donated items for the silent auction. Tickets will be on sale beginning next Sunday. Include fun, frivolity, a lovely dinner, 2 beverages, live music, dancing, and a chance to make new friends for only $25. It's half price. It was $50. No.
Do we get wet?
Well, I could probably turn the hose on.
Can you run the sprinkler?
We can put a spray out.
Not a bad idea.
Big kids
Maybe a
that run
misting
through it.
system at the front door or something. We're seeing many people make use of our community cupboard, and the cupboard becomes bare weekly. When you're at the store, please pick up a few extra items for those who are less financially abundant at this time. And I have really seen that used in the last few years, and it just doesn't seem to go away. That need is continuing. Don't forget, if you've signed up for the marketing team, please plan to stay after for an organizational meeting. And with that, let's go ahead and get to the back and do our circle.